and I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story about the mother of all fishes. So we're going to be talking about one of my personal heroes. I want to introduce you to her, or perhaps reintroduce you to her. You may have heard me talk about her before. Dr. Emilyn Moore was a remarkable and accomplished scientist who received rare recognition in her own time. I'm by no means the first person to chronicle her life and accomplishments, and there was a great appreciation of Dr. Moore published in Fisheries this past August, which I was honored to be included as a co-author on. Dr. Moore was many things. She was a lifelong educator, a polymath, a public servant, and a leader of men and women throughout most of her career. She was a pioneer in the application of ecology to fisheries management in New York State. She was incredibly active in the American Fisheries Society for decades, serving on multiple committees and as the first woman president, and often as the only woman in the room. She published continuously and on an impressive array of subjects: elementary education, botany, parasitology, fish culture, ecology, water pollution. She served on at least 12 AFS committees in addition to the presidency, and is the namesake of the Emilyn Moore Prize awarded by AFS annually since 2009. While she's best known for her surveys of the inland waters of New York State, she was also appointed to help organize one of the first interstate conferences on restoring Lake Erie fisheries, and worked at the Bingham Oceanographic Laboratory of Yale University following her retirement from New York State service. Even before I was aware of who Dr. Moore was, I was introduced to her work. Back in my previous duties with DEC, I first encountered the 1938 Biological Survey of Long Island when I worked in the Division of Marine Resources in the early 1990s. I was writing a habitat restoration plan for the Long Island Sound watershed and came across this treasure trove of information. It contained not only the fish of the freshwater and marine environments, but the plants, invertebrates, assessments of the water quality, as well as further historical perspective on what had been present in an even earlier time. For me as an ecologist, it was though that study anticipated what I needed 50 plus years later. I sought out Dr. Moore's work again a decade later in my current job as rare fish unit leader. In my work planning restoration of historic populations of fish, there is no better roadmap out there than these watershed surveys. As I looked deeper into the surveys and met more people familiar with Dr. Moore, I grew to appreciate just how remarkable she was. And I keep using that word, but why was she remarkable? What made her the person that we read about today? How did she contribute to the diversity and inclusion of New York's fisheries as a profession and as a philosophy? I'm going to delve a bit into what I think shaped her and positioned her to dominate the fisheries field in her day. So where did she start? Emilyn was born in 1872 on a farm in Batavia, New York. Batavia is southwest of Rochester in a very fertile, swampy plain. 1872 was also the year that suffrage leader Susan B. Anthony was arrested for registering to vote. The Civil War had ended less than 10 years prior. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing, and children were just beginning to have mandatory public education. The town was growing and industrializing rapidly. New schools were being built, the railroad had arrived, and yet the town didn't have proper public sanitation. Emilyn was the sixth of 11 children. Her father, John, had immigrated from Switzerland, and her mother, Christina, had immigrated from what is now Germany. The family farm was a mixture of crops, timber, dairy stock, and was on the outskirts of the growing city. Here in this clip from the US Census, we can see that Emilyn was attending school at age 8, as were most of her siblings. They appear to have been a fairly average farm family in 1880. The most tantalizing detail about the family farm is perhaps its location. The farmland abutted a tributary to Tonawanda Creek, and this proximity nurtured her attraction to natural science. An interview with Dr. Moore later in life attributed her swamp visits to sparking her curiosity. Botany was an early passion for Emilyn and remained a component of her studies throughout most of her career. Her mother died along with an infant brother in 1881, but we knew Emilyn continued school, even completing high school, which was not a given for girls in those days. Our next point of reference comes in 1895. Emilyn followed a path to higher education that was considered respectable for young women at that time. She attended the Geneseo Normal School, which is now SUNY Geneseo. In fact, if you're not aware, many of the SUNY schools in our system now started as what were normal schools throughout the state. We don't know if it was intellectual curiosity alone, or if it was coupled with a desire to avoid marriage or remaining on the family farm. It may have been her desire to be a scientist, but she followed one of the only paths available that didn't involve getting married. So she went to normal school at 21, a little later in life than might be expected. Normal school was typically a 2-year program focused on training primary school teachers. Normal schools in the US began in the 1820s and 30s as part of the call for free, non-sectarian, standardized education that sprung from a theory that basic education was a stabilizing force on society and that citizens could not maintain freedom if they were ignorant. Some of you may be familiar with the writings of Horace Mann, and he drove a lot of the development of this type of education. After an economic depression in the 1890s, there was a flood of immigrants filling the demand for basic labor during the Industrial Revolution and the economic boom of the Gilded Age. There was a push to Americanize and assimilate these newcomers. So these normal schools fulfilled a desire to standardize and improve the quality of education across the country. Emilyn was riding the crest of a wave in education that shifted from a male-dominated profession to a female-dominated one. Unfortunately, this also meant that women were paid 60 to 70% less than male counterparts. One of the things that Emilyn taught was nature study. The theory behind nature study was to introduce rural children to the basics of nature and interest them in farm life to stem the flow of people from farms to cities during the Industrial Revolution. Additionally, nature study was thought to stimulate the mind to basic inquiry and curiosity, which in turn supported scientific and rational thinking. Cornell was an incubator for nature study and developed an extension program for not only farmers, but their wives and children to support farm productivity and the use of the best land and livestock management techniques. Farm wives were taught efficient management of the farmstead food resources with the idea of making farming more desirable to family living. Children were taught to observe the turning of the seasons and the life processes of the plants and animals around them. In 1898, James Needham published his book, Outdoor Studies, a reading book of nature study. The primary audience was children, but it was received as a textbook for primary school teachers on how to approach nature study with their pupils. It was well reviewed by leading teachers' colleges of the day and is still considered a seminal work in science education. Later, Anna Botsford Comstock published Handbook of Nature Study in 1911, which became an instant classic. Keep those names in mind, by the way. Upon graduation, Emilyn taught in elementary and secondary schools for several years in Scottsville and Cattaraugus, New York. By 1900, she was teaching in Cooperstown, boarding in a local home with a fellow teacher. 1890 to 1900 is classified as a period of teacher rebellion. 75% of teachers in the US were women, but they were often paid 40% of the male teachers' salaries. The pay disparity was defended by the fact that male teachers were often married and needed to support families. Women teachers, especially in cities, began to organize and demand equal pay. Meanwhile, in science at this time, the 1899 transactions of the American Fisheries Society recorded discussion at the annual meeting. This discussion was regarding the relationship between animals and their environment and the necessity to study the natural history of species. This photo is the actual graduating class of 1900 from Cooperstown High School, and no doubt Ms. Moore taught at least some of these students. By 1902, at age 30, Emilyn had saved some money and sought to quench her thirst for further scientific training by enrolling at Cornell University. Cornell opened to students in the fall of 1868, and founder Ezra Cornell endowed the school on the principle of equal access to higher education by all, including women, people of color, and those of limited means. When Emilyn arrived, they had recently appointed Mrs. Comstock as their first female professor. In nearly all institutions of higher learning at that time, women were titled as instructors, but almost never professors. Emilyn graduated in just 2.5 years with honors and was elected to Sigma Xi, the Science Honor Society founded at Cornell. All women students resided in Sage Hall, which even had its own dining hall. New York State as a whole had undergone progressive social reforms under Governor Theodore Roosevelt and later Al Smith. Environmental conservation and sanitation programs were also greatly advanced. Social welfare and public hygiene programs were considered best run by women, even to the point of government staffing. So in some ways, New York State was even more liberal at that time than it is now. And here are some further notes on developments in fisheries science at this point. In 1903, Tarleton Bean published his catalog of the fishes of New York. He had a long and distinguished career with the Smithsonian, New York Aquarium, U.S. Fish Commission, and New York State Conservation Commission, among others. However, he was primarily a collector and cataloger. These types of lists of plants or animals collected from different localities were the standard practice since the 1700s in the time of Linnaeus. Tarleton Bean cataloged 20 freshwater fish in New York as of 1903. By the end of Dr. Moore's surveys, she would have cataloged over 150. In 1904, John Titcomb, future chief of fish culture for New York, is quoted in the Transactions of the American Fisheries Society as calling for the detailed studies on the utility of specific plants for the pond culture of fish. Again, this is an important point. Once Emilyn finished her summer field studies at Cornell in 1905, she immediately enrolled in Wellesley College. Wellesley was founded by Henry and Pauline Durant with the mission of providing a higher education experience for women that should be equivalent to that available to men. Emilyn did not stay long at Wellesley, though. She earned her Master of Arts degree in botany in 1906, again in record time. Armed with her newest degree, Emilyn became an instructor, no, not a professor, at the Trenton Normal School in New Jersey. She joined professional teaching societies and published in botany journals. She was becoming more visible and vocal in her field. It was at this time that her advocacy of teaching science in primary and secondary schools is documented. Her writings cautioned against teaching pure science without linking it to real-world application. She did real-world experiments with her students that involved touching pieces of bread and pencils and change that they might have in their pocket to culture plates, and showing them what types of bacteria grew from just things around the classroom. And in some schools, this type of experimentation is still conducted to this day, but it was revolutionary at the time. She even, during this time, argued and critiqued James Needham's work at professional society meetings. While Emilyn was appointed to replace an instructor who took another job, it was very common for women to leave the profession because they got married. Remaining employed after marriage was not an option for women in the early 20th century. Ironic, considering that their unmarried status was the justification for lower wages. Some married women were able to keep working in science by volunteering to work with their husbands as research assistants or illustrators. The Comstocks were one such partnership, though Anna came into her own at Cornell eventually. Some of the earliest women members of AFS participated under the sponsorship of their husbands, many of whom were not even in the fisheries field. The facilities for teaching science at the Trenton Normal School appeared equivalent to that of any men's college by this time. Again, these are the actual labs in 1910. In 1908, Emilyn was awarded the first of 2 Walker Prizes by the Boston Society of Natural History for her publication in the Bulletin of the Torrey Botanical Club, entitled The Study of Winter Buds with reference to their growth and leaf content. The labs at Trenton enabled her to prepare the specimens used in that paper for sectioning. The methods of the paper describe a pretty complicated, and I'm not a botanist, so maybe this is sort of a no-brainer to other people, but a complicated process of replacing the fluids in the leaf stems and going through a process of cedar oil and paraffin and alcohol to prepare them as part of the sectioning. Modern day recipients of the Walker Prize include several Nobel laureates. Emilyn left the Trenton Normal School just as progressivism in teaching was beginning to take hold. Women were becoming principals of elementary schools and even superintendents in smaller districts, but men continued to dominate school administration. And there was overt concern at the time that women teachers were emasculating society. Emilyn spent a year as an exchange professor at Huguenot College for Women in Wellington, South Africa. And for those of you that want to take a look, I'm a history buff, but looking at this application, it talks about people applying as a passport for themselves accompanied by their wife and children. So the fact that a woman would be applying for a passport on her own apparently was not normal based on the form. But why did she go to South Africa? It seems kind of random, I imagine. Wellesley College, where Emilyn had earned her master's degree, was one of the so-called Seven Sisters colleges in the Northeast, those that were traditionally women's schools. These schools often had a Christian mission tradition. Huguenot College was originally founded as a Protestant women's seminary. After the British retook the South African colony from the Dutch, they endeavored to improve education for the colonists. Huguenot College transitioned into a normal school for upper and middle class white Afrikaans young women, and all its professors through the early 20th century were American, excuse me. In her later life, Emilyn fondly recalled the experience in a newspaper article and indicated that she was already teaching and studying at Cornell when the opportunity arose to swap places with a Huguenot College teacher who went to Cornell for the academic year. Emilyn spent her Christmas surrounded by baboons and ostriches and returned to Cornell in 1912 to complete her PhD. So Emilyn came home from Africa and re-enrolled at Cornell. Her thesis was on the relationship between aquatic plants and the pond culture of fish. She noted the growing habitats of individual species of pond plants and other pond creatures that ate them or took shelter in them. Her PhD advisor, James Needham, who apparently survived her critique, was an entomologist, but also taught the first limnology courses at Cornell. He guided her research on the relationship of insects to pond plants. Remember, he wrote a widely adopted text in Nature Study in 1898. So since Emilyn had been teaching this subject to her primary and high school students, she was quite familiar with him and his work. She also studied at Cornell under Dr. George Embody, an early proponent of science-driven fish culture and stocking policies. By the time her thesis was completed, Emilyn was on the cusp of becoming the Dr. Moore we know today. For those of you keeping score, she was 42 years old when she earned this PhD. Dr. Moore's thesis was considered so important to modern fish culture, it was published by the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries in 1915. Her entry in the 1914 edition of Women's Who's Who of America shows her honors and diverse lists of publications. Upon the award of her PhD, Dr. Moore became a botany instructor at Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, again, an instructor, but was eventually promoted to assistant professor. Her initial appointment was noted in Science magazine. Vassar was another of the Seven Sisters colleges. She continued to publish and perform research. And during her time at Vassar, Dr. Moore collaborated with an English professor to plant a Shakespeare garden on the campus grounds using the labor of their combined classes in 1915 and 16. Shakespeare gardens were fashionable at this time around the 300th anniversary of the famous writer's death. The garden strove to grow all the myriad plants mentioned in Shakespeare's plays and sonnets. The garden, though modified, still exists today. In her letters to her dear friend and former Cornell lab mate, Hortense Butler Haywood, a scientist in her own right, most known for her research on dragonflies, Dr. Moore described her new quarters at Vassar, an extensive and exhausting teaching schedule. At the time, there was no president at the college, and in Dr. Moore's opinion, things were running just fine. However, by 1919, a new college president had been hired, and a letter to Hortense dated January of 1920 hinted at, quote, some harrowing experiences, unquote, left behind at Vassar the previous June. She wrote, quote, sometime I'll tell you, but to say on paper what I think of their president and the Vassar policies would burn a hole through the mailbag, unquote. Many of Mrs. Haywood's papers are available at the University of Iowa archives for those of you that are interested, but I will warn you, Dr. Moore's handwriting is atrocious. While she was teaching at Vassar and basically throughout her entire career, Dr. Moore spent summers continuing her research. She took on aquatic plant research at the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries Biological Station at Fairport, Iowa. She was once more studying the relationship between plants and fish productivity in hatchery ponds. John Titcomb, another name you should keep in mind, was also working at the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries during that time, and their paths would cross again regularly. The U.S. entered World War I in April of 1917, sparking an interest in boosting fish production to alleviate war-related food shortages. The same January 1920 letter to Mrs. Haywood talks about her research for the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries and how much she enjoyed her work. Unfortunately, she indicates that they are a poor bureau and cannot pay her to stay on. At the same time she wrote the letter, she was on a fellowship at the University of Wisconsin working with Chancellor Juday. Dr. Moore joined AFS in 1918, likely sponsored for membership by Needham, Embody, and Titcomb. In those days, new members were admitted by vote. She attended the AFS meeting in Louisville, Kentucky as soon as she was eligible in the fall of 1919 and presented her paper on the importance of pondweeds to fish culture based on her U.S. Bureau of Fisheries research. Attendees at the meeting included John Titcomb, the chief fish culturist of New York, along with her PhD advisor, Dr. Needham, and her former professor, Dr. George Embody. By now, Dr. Moore is a 47-year-old professional. She has had a full and distinguished teaching career. She has been a prominent and active member of more than one professional society. She's retained an active network of former classmates and professors from Cornell, a group of allies and advocates. She finds herself in need of a new job at a time the country is in the midst of a world war and a global pandemic. The nickname given to her by her Cornell lab mates was Scipio, and for those of you, like me, who have not studied the classics, Scipio Africanus was the Roman general who eventually defeated Hannibal of the elephants crossing the Alps fame, in a battle in northern Africa. Scipio is considered one of the best military commanders and strategists of all time. I like to think this nickname was not only a nod to Emilyn's stint in Africa, but to her leadership and strategic capabilities. By now, you must be wondering, how did Dr. Moore come to the Conservation Commission? Like with most firsts, it was quiet and fairly unnoticed. The needs of the New York State Conservation Commission were laid out in the 1919 annual report to the legislature. There were 4 main points that are relevant to the future of our heroine and make it clear that her unique set of skills and her network are setting her on a path to a second career in fisheries fame. First point, properly trained men for water quality and aquatic biology are in short supply due to lack of training and the war and the pandemic. 2, efficient and effective use of state resources is a constant refrain by Governor Al Smith on the necessities of the war. Stocked fish gain attention as being wasted in unproductive waters and should be used as an effective means to feed the masses. 3, Chancey Juday and George Embody have both conducted surveys of some of the streams and lakes in New York to understand their productivity. The Conservation Commission and Chief Fish Culturist John Titcomb desired to have more of these surveys to set permanent stocking policies to avoid waste of time and fish in unsuitable waters. Both Embody and Juday have full-time jobs already, so the Conservation Commission wanted to hire their own men. And number 4, a request was made by residents of Lake George for the state to build a new hatchery right on the lake because after stocking as many as 17 species into the lake, fishing was still terrible. All of this was marking a new approach to ecological foundations for fisheries management and a departure from the Seth Green-dominated philosophy. All the major players knew Dr. Moore from her involvement in AFS, from school at Cornell, her fellowship in Wisconsin, and her work with the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries that overlapped with Titcomb. In 1920, the year this photo was taken, Dr. Moore was hired as a full-time biologist at the Conservation Commission for $2,500 per year by John Titcomb, who had worked with her in Iowa. Titcomb is seated in the desk at the right. Dr. Moore was the first woman to be hired in such a capacity by the agency and one of a handful anywhere in the country. Her official title was Special Investigator in Fish Culture, but she worked on a variety of scientific investigations. Her first department publication was a biological survey of Lake George, New York. This slender volume was a foreshadowing of things to come. The final report included an introduction by John Titcomb, who singled out Dr. Moore as the leading specialist on the subject of botany. It is this network of colleagues and allies who brought in this more than competent scientist to fulfill the state's needs. So what did Dr. Moore think about all of this? Oh, I just realized, Matt, I'm not sure if I selected the audio. So let's see if this works. I have an actual audio clip from a radio interview that Dr. Moore gave in 1944, but I'm not sure if I said it right.
Are you playing? Can you hear it on your end? Okay, yeah, we can't hear it.
Okay.
What you might be able to do if you want is you could back out of your presentation, toggle that audio button, and then jump back in and jump to this slide maybe.
Okay. Let me see. Actually, why don't I just move on because it's not that important. And if people are interested, I do have the full audio of the recording. So just I don't want to take up too much time. It's kind of cool, though, to be able to hear her own voice. Okay. So the Lake George report was followed quickly by a 1922 stream pollution study. Dr. Moore helped prepare the photographic plates included in the report to assist readers in the identification of species. We use indicator species just like this in the department to this day to describe the level of impairment present in streams. Dr. Moore was prolific in her radio and newspaper interviews. She believed deeply in public outreach and the importance of educating the public about what the department was doing. Her travels and speaking engagements across the country were covered by the New York Times and the AP Wire service. By 1926, the Conservation Commission had once again reorganized, and there was now a division of fish and game headed by the game protectors. I have found no record of whose idea the watershed surveys were, but it seemed to have been something that had been percolating for quite some time. In April of that year, the legislature appropriated $15,000 to the Conservation Commission to initiate its program of biological surveys. That is equivalent to about $210,000 today. The watershed approach was novel at the time, as traditionally things like fish stocking, game protectors, and the like were managed at the county level. This time, Dr. Moore was in charge of the survey. She enlisted the help of her former instructor, George Embody, and 2 other professors from Cornell, as well as a fellow from RPI, to conduct the water chemistry studies. The final report included an introduction from Dr. Moore and sections authored by the field team leads, as well as maps and illustrations. The surveys as a whole continued through 1938 and covered all the watersheds of New York. From this first survey under her direction, she engaged the services of Ellen Edmondson, an accomplished scientific illustrator who worked for the U.S. Department of Agriculture and had also attended Cornell University. Dr. Moore felt it was incredibly important to show the fish to the public in their true colors and forms. Here we see Miss Edmondson working on the painting of the brook trout, our state freshwater fish. She worked from both live and preserved specimens, producing a strikingly accurate depiction of the fish that is also beautiful to look at. She considered these to be portraits of the fish, the individual fish that she was capturing. And many of you have probably seen this image all over the place, but this is just one of the paintings that Miss Edmondson did and is, out in the public domain. Miss Edmondson was responsible for the vast majority of the illustrations during the 13 surveys, traveling across the state to paint in the field with the collecting crews. These images endure as art and as important examples of the species in life. They are now in the public domain and are always in the top of a Google search for images of the species. As the surveys progressed, the field crews grew. Dr. Moore organized and coordinated the field work, but did not participate in the field collections herself. Bear in mind, by the time the surveys ended, she was fairly advanced in age. She brought in college professors and their students, and private homes and local schools were used as field labs and base camps. Much of the crew slept and worked in tents. More information about the surveys and staff is available in a wonderful article by Bob Daniels in the May 2011 issue of Fisheries. One thing is noticeable. Dr. Moore had become an ally herself. She employed women on the surveys where she could, notably Ellen Edmondson, but she also hired Mrs. J.R. Greeley as the survey's curator for the fish vouchers. In this photo of the Lake Champlain survey crew of 1929, we can see Dr. Moore at center and 4 additional women she had brought on staff. As you can see, the field staff camped out all summer while the collections and outdoor studies were going on. Private citizens provided the use of their boats and homes, and often researchers stayed in state parks or on Conservation Commission campgrounds. The day's plant and fish collections were identified and cataloged in the tent camps. Specimens were preserved and sent to the New York State Museum and other institutions, including the University of Michigan, Cornell University, for their permanent collections. Invertebrates were often preserved and sent to university experts for further identification. Water chemistry was done in similarly rough conditions at the actual field sites on truck tailgates with portable lab boxes. Nets and other gear were hung, dried, and repaired on site like some sort of traveling fish circus. In nearly every survey year, Dr. Moore hosted 1 or more lectures about the survey and its findings for the communities and local sportsmen's clubs. She also gave numerous newspaper interviews and appeared in the New York Times Fish and Game column around 20 times. Interviews with people who worked on the survey as students and a few people who were present as children remarked on the respect commanded by Dr. Moore. She arrived at field sites in a chauffeured car, When word came that Dr. Moore was making an appearance, everyone scrambled to make this camp shipshape. One former student assistant remarked that she ran the survey with an iron fist. The last survey was performed in 1939 and covered the southern Lake Ontario watershed. All of the watershed reports were edited by Dr. Moore herself and included an introduction authored by her. The reports to the legislature were extremely thorough and had the obvious aim of being instructive and well explained. She retained the tradition of annotated lists of fishes collected at each locality, but went far beyond that in her reports. There were recommendations for stocking, documentation of stream pollution, information on contaminants and diseases of fish, lists of important plants and fish spawning areas, and advice on the pros and cons of planned public works projects. By 1930, the budget for the survey had increased to $50,000. That translates to over $750,000 in today's money. The surveys carried on for a total of 14 years and covered the entire state, including the 1938 two-volume survey of both the fresh and salt waters of Long Island, carried out with the assistance of the U.S. Fish Commission. If you look closely at the tray in the picture, you can see the oyster toadfish being cataloged. Those very fish are still in their jar at the New York State Museum because I know I've seen them. In 1927, Dr. Moore was elected president of the American Fisheries Society. She was the first woman to be elected and remained the only woman president for 55 years afterward. She attended all but one meeting during her long membership. Here she is in 1930, front and center. There are three other women in the portrait. John Titcomb, George Embody, and several of her other members of the Biological Survey are also present in the picture. Dr. Moore continued on with the watershed surveys and kept up an active speaking and publishing pace the entire time. By this time, Dr. Moore was widely recognized as a leader in her field. She attended and spoke at many national meetings, including one of the first meetings of the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies in 1938, just after the passage of the federal Pittman-Robertson Wildlife Restoration Act that is still a significant source of funding to my agency. She was the only woman present at the entire meeting. In 1939, at the conclusion of the survey, she was awarded an honorary doctorate from Hobart and William Smith College. By this time, she was the chief aquatic biologist for the state, equivalent to a bureau chief today, and remains the only woman to hold the position. Her recommendation in the final survey report was to shift emphasis toward improved fisheries management as a whole, rather than rely solely on stocking policies. She also advocated for continued monitoring of stream and pond water quality. She stayed with the Conservation Department until 1944. She was 72 at this time and retired to her home in Slingerlands, where she said she planned to tend her garden. Apparently, she had some sense of humor in spite of the stern reputation as a taskmaster. When a reporter asked her what was her favorite rose in her garden, she answered with a sly smile, salmon. Her retirement notice appeared in the New York Times, local newspapers, alumni newsletters at Wellesley, Vassar, Cornell, and Trenton State Normal School, as well as in professional society journals for the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the American Fisheries Society. Believe it or not, she wasn't quite done. She continued to do some research and publishing as an associate of the Bigelow Laboratory of Yale University for another couple of years. She also had a Conservation Department marine research vessel named in her honor. Here she is shown christening the vessel in Freeport, New York at the age of 84. So what is her legacy to us? Much more than a boat and a shelf of dusty books. First and foremost, these surveys remain to this day as the most comprehensive and rigorous state fisheries surveys carried out anywhere in the country. They were noted as so at the time. They still serve as a baseline for fish distribution in the state and are still frequently referenced. In 2009, the American Fisheries Society created an award in honor of Dr. Moore. Dr. Emilyn Moore Prize is a career achievement award given to a society member who demonstrates the strong commitment and exemplary service to ensuring equal opportunity to access to higher education and fisheries. Awardees must demonstrate this commitment in more than one fisheries discipline. And as recently as 2016, our own recently retired Doug Carlson and Bob Daniels, formerly of the State Museum, published the Atlas of Inland Fishes of New York State, drawing heavily on Dr. Moore's reports. There's a further legacy of the stream and pond numbering system for the state, still in use today, instituted in those surveys. And we adhere to the principles she outlined for stocking fish. We still value the public outreach and education that she so strongly advocated. And she also embraced cooperation with partner institutions between the divisions in our agency. How as a woman was Dr. Moore able to achieve so much and be recognized in an era where women could not marry and remain employed and could not open their own bank account without their husband or father's permission? I believe, and there is some scholarship that supports this, her ability and self-possession were nurtured and buoyed by the environment she found herself in. Clearly, the relationships and the network she had built supported her and allowed her own skills to shine bright. She was assertive enough to speak up with her ideas and not be apologetic with her critiques, even when she was the only woman in the room. She did admit near the end of her life that she sometimes had trouble in making her authority felt. But in her acceptance speech for the AFS presidency, she joked she was glad that the bylaws did not need to be changed to accommodate her election. In tracing all of that wove through her life, I believe Dr. Moore was a remarkable scientist and leader of people, and she obviously worked hard to support and educate herself at high-quality institutions. I also believe that her abilities and competence made her impossible to ignore. It is fortunate for us that she landed where she did among us and that we continue to benefit from her success. Dr. Moore passed away in a nursing home in Guilderland in 1963 at the age of 91. She never married, and her obituary was announced in the New York Times and newspapers and journals across the country. Dr. Emilyn Moore was laid to rest in Churchville, New York, next to her older brother John and her younger sisters May and Sarah. I want to acknowledge the assistance I've had in compiling these materials from several other fans of Dr. Moore and one of her great-grandnieces, Kathy Moore Norton. The illustration at right is by Lauren Zeitkos, one of the authors of the August 2020 Fisheries articles, and is used with her kind permission. And most of all, thank you for allowing me to share my appreciation of a remarkable member of our profession, and please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. All right, folks. Does anyone have any questions or comments for the group?
I'll just go ahead. I have a question. So thanks for sharing this really interesting history of Dr. Moore's life. It's really obvious that she led an impressive.
I think I'm not sure who is speaking, but I think you're muted.
Sorry, it said that someone muted me. So I'll just, yeah, so thanks.
I can hear you now, go ahead.
Great. Sorry, I just don't know where I left off and where you stopped hearing me. You know, she was really impressive and she led an impressive career and was perhaps, one of the lucky few who were able to access the opportunities she did. And, she was exceptional. And in a way, it's really unfortunate that she had to navigate the system that required that exceptionalism to really make it. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are and how we can more broadly learn from this individual woman's story in order to continue making progress towards equity today, particularly for identities that continue to be excluded from equal access to opportunities.
Obviously, so you mentioned a few things in your question. So I'll start with one of them, and you're right, she was a white woman of European descent, so that gave her some advantages even in spite of her gender. And I think the fact that her mother died when she was young and she was part of this very large brood in some ways was freeing for her, however unfortunate it was, because there weren't a lot of expectations in terms of staying on the farm and continuing that. Her youngest brother ended up inheriting that farm. So I think she was freed up to pursue things, to leave home and do those things. But I think that the fact that she was gifted but maintained these networks, I think first and foremost, just in reading the correspondence, because again, I'm a total history nerd, but just reading the letters she wrote to people, any grad lab now, right? There was a group of women that shared lab space at Cornell, and there were, the letters back and forth talked about the gossip about who was sitting at which desk, and, the summer session was being led by who. She was a teaching assistant. She did all of this stuff. And I think the combination of intentionally seeking out the other women she was sort of thrown in with, but maintaining those high standards and also maintaining those networks of the men and inserting herself into those spaces, right? AFS as an organization at the time she joined, I mean, granted, the meetings were nothing of the size we see now. In-person attendance was maybe 50 people. But of those 50 people, 47 of them were men. Occasionally there were other women that attended, but by and large, it was spaces dominated by men. So I think the fact that she was able to enter those spaces and speak out, it was really, it was, I think, part of what just got her to where she was with the fisheries department. I think the fact, and she said as herself in her radio interview, the fact that by the time she got to our agency, she was, middle-aged. She wasn't taking crap from anybody, right? She was over it. So I think that's part of it as well. And I think just the physical clearing of space by the First World War and the global pandemic literally cleared the decks. They had not a lot of options. And they had these folks that knew how good she was and said, of course, there's no question that she's going to take this job. What we do now is, as was mentioned in the first talk, you have to intentionally make space for people. It cannot be a passive, increasing diversity and inclusion cannot be a passive endeavor. So, I think that's the other thing is we all have to be conscious of making space for folks that are underrepresented.
Awesome. Thank you, Lisa.
Okay.
Do folks have other questions or comments for Lisa? You can either speak up or raise your hand. Oh, that's a good point. Maybe, we have a few minutes, 10 minutes or so before our next scheduled talk. So I don't know, Lisa, if you wanted to share that.
Yeah, let me see
that
what I
sound
can
bite.
do. Remind me again, what am I doing with the audio?
Yeah, so when you share,
yep.
there's a button that says include computer sound. You got to toggle that. It should be to the left.
Okay, thanks. Let me open the file. Okay, let's see what I can do.
Factories for new construction and employment, for recreation. All these will help not only to win the war, but to win the peace in a new world of tomorrow. And now, through the Forestry Forum, Floyd E. Carlson of the Extension Department to the New York State College of Forestry brings you today's story of the forest and our guest. And now, Mr. Carlson.
Thank you, Sid Anderson. Today, the Forestry Forum breaks new ground and a precedent. And for the first time, have as our guest Dr. Emilyn Moore, Chief Aquatic Biologist of the New York State Conservation Department, Albany, New York, the first woman to appear on the Forestry Forum. It is a great pleasure to have you as our guest here today, Dr. Moore. And I'd like to ask you how many years you've had in service with the New York State Conservation Department and what your assignment has been.
This is my 24th year, Professor Carlson. I was an appointee under civil service in 1920 with the title Investigator in Fish Culture. As I got my bearings in this newly created job, I realized that the nature of my duties required considerable versatility, such as working on trout epidemics in the hatcheries, the food requirements of fish, the effects of pollution on fish life, and the suitability of certain streams, lakes, and ponds for stocking. Then there were such questions to deal with as the fiction of fish ways, the proper mingling of science and practice in fish culture. And I never raised a fish in my life.
Well, didn't you feel you were entering a no woman's land and beginning this work? I suppose you were the only woman in the division of Fish and Game.
Yes, I was the only woman, Professor Carlson, in the division of Fish and Game, and the first woman to be named to a permanent job in the State Conservation Department. Fortunately, no one in the department was abashed by a skirted presence, and I went about my work feeling as comfortable as an old shoe. I felt it mattered greatly to have the wise use of all brains, women's and men's brains, as well as the wise use of our natural resources.
Well, where had you received your training?
I'm glad you were able to play that, Lisa. That was awesome.
Yeah, I think it's so funny too, because you hear about this formidable woman. She has this little tiny warbly old lady voice. But I can see, do you think the Whova platform would support it? I can load, it's about a 14-minute interview. I could load it onto the site for people if they want to listen to it later.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you can somehow pass that audio file to me, maybe we can share it in Google Drive or OneDrive. And then, I mean, I could even put it as its own session or something like that where people could access it.
Okay, yeah, that's great. And I have a huge, I'm actually working with our state agency library to really get a better archive of her writings and, you know, those newspaper clippings and all of those things. I have a growing folder of stuff, source materials. So if that becomes sort of pulled to fruition, I will let people know. You know, it's like I still have things with her handwriting on it. It's, you know, fangirling, but it's kind of cool.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Thanks a lot, Matt.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. And so if folks don't have any last minute questions, I think maybe the best move would be to have like a 5-minute bio break before Lisa, our other Lisa Kerr starts her talk. So maybe let's be back here at 11:15. Thank you.